Of course, the topic of persuasion is absolutely related to negotiation. It is part and parcel of negotiation. So here we'll talk about persuasion and influence. Really, those are words that are used synonymously. And I'll break it down in particular into 6 different elements in the process of persuasion. We'll also talk briefly about some ethical issues, or what I call the dark side of persuasion, a few additional tactics or strategies based on a lot of research that's been done in this area, and finally, just a little bit on emotions. We'll talk more about these things and actually try them out in our virtual synchronous session. So, why has influence become so important, not just in terms of negotiation, but in general? And as you probably have noticed throughout your career, we see fewer and fewer layers of management, right? So instead of having 7 to 10 to 12 different steps to get to the top of the organization, we see more like 4 or 5 these days, which means fewer people have specific titles that mean boss or director, and more people that are under their span of control. And so influence becomes very important. And by the way, just because you have the title, as you know, is giving you one avenue for influencing, but just using that title alone can result in some problems, and we can talk about that. Influence is also important because we have seen over the last 20 or 25 years increasing use of teams as a way of getting work done in organizations. And again, very few people in a team are given that title that would suggest somebody has positional power over others. So being able to influence becomes important. In terms of negotiation, in particular, we've seen a much reduced focus on one-off transactions and a much greater focus on longer-term relationships. So we have these preferred vendor, preferred supplier, and again, this means it's not about ultimatums or threats or power plays, but rather how can we look at the relationship and use the art and science of persuasion and influence as a way of trying to ensure that everyone's goals are being met. And I mentioned this briefly, right? Just because you have the authority in your position doesn't mean that you're going to get a good response to your directive. The main difference that I see is that between compliance and commitment. Do this because I'm your boss and I told you so, would result in employees doing, well, just enough to get you off their back. But when employees see the logic, they feel empowered, their knowledge is respected, and there's some sense of empowerment, there's a much greater chance of being committed to the outcome, committed to the task, doing whatever it takes to get the job done. And so that kind of outcome from employees has made influence that much more necessary. And as I sort of alluded to, this idea that as we are well in the realm of knowledge workers want to be respected for their knowledge. So if I get things done through fear or other strategies that would bring about compliance, again, you can imagine the potential downfall of that approach. So, talking about persuasion and influence, and I have a little quiz or trivia couple of questions. So, I'll read you the first one, and I want you to jot down on a scrap piece of paper what you think the correct answer is. So if you were trying to convince an organization or a person to go with the costlier of your potential proposals, and by costly I don't just mean money, but resources. If you want them to agree to the more costly proposal, should you start with the most expensive option, or should you start with the least expensive option in your presentation? So you might jot that down, most or least costly. Here's the second trivia question. Will you be more successful in persuading by telling someone what he or she will gain from complying with your request, or what she or he will lose if they don't? So you might just write lose or gain. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to leave you in suspense, but there are actual answers, and yeah, sure, you might be thinking there's a little bit of an it depends part of that, but actually this is based on a fair bit of research. So hold on to your hats, I'll come back. So all of us negotiate, all of us persuade. Some of us are more successful than others, but in the absence of some real knowledge about the underlying processes of negotiation, the biases, the cognitive processing pathways, the way human behavior works, many of us have perhaps outdated or mistaken ideas about what makes you a successful influencer or persuader. And one of those mistakes is, right, I know what I want, and I'm just going to talk long and passionately and pound my fist until I beat you into, and I'm speaking metaphorically, into submission, right? Here's what I want, and I'm going to make, I'm going to make you agree with me at some point or another. I'm just going to convince you. And that is a fairly common mistake. Another one is we don't always recognize how credible we are. We don't step up to the plate. We don't assume and project the credibility we have. And so we some of us have this idea of, well, I guess maybe I don't really have, the right to ask this question, or I don't really, there's this imposter syndrome, for example. So I couldn't tell you with the greatest sense of confidence that this in fact is true. Another common mistake is thinking dichotomously or simplistically about stakeholder positions. I present this idea and either you're with me or against me. And where do you go with that, right? So that's another common mistake. And finally, yes, logic is a very potent form of persuasion, but just because you make the rational case up front, if that's the only tool in your toolbox, if you lack flexibility in influence tactics, you're not going to be successful. And by the way, even when you do make the quote rational case, the logic that you are leaning into to make this case may or may not be that logic which is so motivating to the person whom you're trying to persuade, your target. So let's step a little bit further into this. And here's the thing. As I mentioned before, there's a fair amount of science in social psychology and communication, even in computer-mediated communication, where we're seeing, of course, a lot more of our time being spent. And so there is an art to persuasion, and you know what I'm talking about. You know that there are some people who have this really uncanny ability of making friends, of showing themselves to be trustworthy and genuine, and you just want to do business with them, right? And these are people who have this charisma or this way about them that just, again, creates that trust. But the rest of it's really science. There is science of how our brains collect information, how our brains analyze information. Some of that has been written about extensively in terms of biases, and human behavior. So, attitudes that influence behaviors and influence, how we interpret situations etc. And so understanding a little bit more about the underlying science that relates to persuasion is kind of what this chapter and some of what we're going to talk about is all about. So one of the things that you're going to hear from me multiple times is that what some of us may think about as persuasion or influence is not, in fact, persuasion or influence in the way I think about it. So when you use threats or ultimatums or fear or manipulative, dirty tricks and lies, that's not persuasion. That is manipulation. And the problem with manipulation is it has the opposite effect. When you are found out to be lying or deceiving or somehow using smoke and mirrors, the trust is potentially irreparably harmed. And so if you think about persuasion and influence as doing whatever it takes to get other people to do what you want them to do, you run the risk of damaging the relationship with that person, not only now, but in the future, as well as anyone else that person is connected with. Your reputation, as you know, is something that's very fluid, and you are connected with many more people with a click of a mouse than you might realize. So remember this, persuasion is a social process, right? It's not this one-shot transaction, and it does because humans as social creatures are dynamic and sometimes unpredictable. So what you might experiment with that works today and with this person in this context may or may not be as effective another day, even with the same person in a different context. So there's this trial and error and really being mindful about what is and isn't working so that you could learn and be more effective. Persuasion is about discovering what is it that this other person wants. Now remember, I said earlier, common mistake is I know what I want, and all I need to do is hit you over the head metaphorically to make you agree and do what I want you to do. And that is absolutely incorrect. Instead, it's about trying to understand the other person, to discover what makes them tick. And when you do so, you prepare accordingly. So, not everybody is concerned as much as the next about delivery, about quality, about price, about reputation, payment terms, etc. Right? So, each one of those may have a higher or lower priority. So understanding, discovering what this person or this organization wants, preparing your attempts in advance in accordance with what you've discovered, and presenting in such a way that makes sense given the context in which you're operating is really what persuasion is all about. It's about dialogue, not what I often call a collective monologue. It's not, again, he who talks the longest and loudest who wins, but rather, how do I use my understanding of others' motivations, prepare my arguments in advance, present in such a way that takes those arguments into account, and engage in a dialogue. You want people to act, think, feel in a certain way that they might not have acted, thought, or felt prior to this persuasion conversation. So in order for there to be that buy-in, in order for there to be a lasting effect of this change that you are hoping to happen, it's a two-way conversation, it's a dialogue. And it bears saying, and I may say this again, that it's not what you do to another. Persuasion is what you do with another. And just sit on that for a second and you'll see why I say that. So one thing I'm going to ask you to do, and pause this recording, is to put these ideas in action. And we're going to do this in two phases. One is I want you to think about an opportunity in your organization where perhaps you have an idea that would significantly improve a process or result in a new product or service, or perhaps enhance a system that the organization uses that would ultimately result in greater efficiency, greater customer satisfaction, greater competitiveness, increased happiness of the stakeholders. But your idea, however logical and wonderful and full of promise it may be, also meets with anybody who resists change, who is everybody. So again, perhaps you could take a screenshot or somehow capture this document and think through what your idea in your organization is. Who are the targets or the implementers of this change? What would their objections likely be, both immediately and perhaps, in the medium term? What do you think you could say or do to reduce their resistance and gain their commitment? And finally, what would success look like? Now, that last question might sound pretty obvious, right? They're on board with my plan, but more than that, not just what are they doing, how are they doing this new process or philosophy that would be an indication of its success. So take a pause, flesh this out a little bit. We're going to come back to this and give you opportunities to strengthen your plan. But I want you to think about this. Okay. So in the reading that I gave you, that's from my textbook, I talk about 6 critical steps for effective persuasion. One thing I just want to make clear is these are not necessarily lockstep. First you do number 1, then you do number 2, etc. I mean, certainly numbers 1 and 2 are really good places to start. With regard to the 4 other steps, these are ways of thinking about being effective in your persuasion attempts, and you might choose one, you might choose a couple, but come prepared because you may not be successful in your first try, and if that's all you've got, if you've shown all your cards and the other person is not buying it, you've wasted this opportunity. So anything beyond the first 2 bullets are going to be chances for you to prepare, just as you would for a negotiation, for not an immediate agreement, but rather a need to kind of move a little bit deeper or more compellingly to get that changed behavior, belief, action. So the first one should be pretty obvious. If I'm trying to convince you, persuade you, I need to know a little bit about what you want and what you need. And part of that just comes from the skill of active listening, which we've talked about, right? So not just the words, but also the feeling, empathy. Now, you may be saying, well, I've never met this person before. I don't have any previous conversations to draw upon. How could I really know what they want? Well, real time, ask these questions and check for understanding. Just because they may say certain things, it would be a good idea to use the skill of feedback to share, here's what I'm hearing, is this accurate? I want to make sure that I've understood that for you, the quality is the top of the list and the delivery is something that you're willing to work with. So understand what it is that others have communicated about what they want. And you can also, since words make up only about 7% of the meaning of communication, you can also really hone your skills on reading others, right? You can practice looking at, observing their behavior. You can observe their facial expressions and how closely they stand to you. You can also interact with them in ways where you are asking them even in the more kind of informal getting to know you stage, these open-ended questions that give you a sense of what it is that makes them tick. But really recognize that what you want is going to be more likely to be granted when you connect that to what the person you're trying to persuade wants. So another really important element is establishing credibility. I mean, quite simply, the messenger is what we consider before we consider the message. So if the messenger is incredible, then we're not going to pay much attention to the message. Think about what kinds of things come through your LinkedIn and your Facebook feeds. And if you see a source like HBR or Fortune or Sloan Management Review, you probably think, oh, this has gone through some vetting, this has gone through some editing, this is probably good stuff. If you read from a journal or from a magazine that is kind of a little woo-woo, my daughter will kill me for saying that, you might think differently about the message that's being sent. So Jay Conger, who has written in this space, has talked about 4 different elements that are critical to establishing credibility. And the first one is kind of the first one we see, right? And you might be thinking, my gosh, this is so obvious. Why would you even bother saying something around how we dress the part? But actually, so often, and even more so during the pandemic, we've gotten a little bit lax about our professionalism. And I've worked in organizations where, sure, we will implement a Friday casual day dress code, but we are very specific about, but it's different when you are visiting the customer, right? So this idea of dressing the part, now not overdressing either. If the people that you're trying to connect with are factory workers, perhaps, for men, you might wear your dress shirt and slacks, but not a tie. And for women, you might wear dress slacks and a sweater, but not necessarily the whole suit or tailored dress. So it's about dressing and acting the part, including these kinds of other things that are part of the impression, the initial impression that you make. One brief message or story I'll relate is if you've never been inside a courtroom, let's say you've gotten a traffic ticket or 2 in your lifetime, one of the things that has failed to surprise me anymore is the occasional person who shows up to present to the judge why they should not have this ticket, why it should be cleared from their record or the fine should be reduced, and the person shows up looking like they've rolled out of bed. And I used to be shocked, now I just kind of roll my eyes. This is, again, an important element of instant credibility. You walk up with that baseball cap and the pants that are all crumpled and falling off of you, and clothes that don't look particularly kempt or clean, and it connotes a lack of respect for yourself, a lack of respect for the court. Again, I know I'm not telling you anything new, but do recognize that that first impression does go a long way to establishing credibility. Another, of course, is how well versed you are in the subject that you are speaking about, that you're trying to persuade. So know your stuff, practice making a presentation, show yourself to be well versed not just on what's in the presentation, but also what likely objections could be raised and how you might talk about those issues, again, demonstrating your expertise. Trustworthiness is a huge part of credibility, right? In one aspect, trustworthiness is consistency, right? Whatever it is that you say you're going to do, you do. You follow through on your promises. That is probably, from the research, the most important element of consistency. I want to trust that what you say is what you'll do, right? The last thing we want is somebody agreeing to do something and then having to chase them down, or them saying, oh, I was just kidding, I really didn't have the right to say that. So trust is essential, and communicating trustworthiness starts with consistency. It even has extensions in how well we are, how much we may be alike. You can establish trustworthiness by saying, oh, I see that you got your degree at Seattle U, so did I, or that's where my son is going. So sometimes trustworthiness can be enhanced by showing the other person how similar we are, where we went to school, what sports teams we root for, what we do in our spare time. And of course, reliability and conscientiousness. And finally, Conger talks about composure. Now, of course, knowing your stuff and practicing, that helps quite a bit. But in order to demonstrate that composure and showing yourself to be professional and calm and able to withstand challenges. Sorry, for the moment, I just got Ketanji Brown Jackson in my mind, right? Knowing your stuff, not getting ruffled, not getting riled up, but being able to accept criticism and accept objections in a way that is, again, more dialogue and not necessarily gotcha. So credibility is key. And thinking about ahead of time, what can I say or do early on, besides dressing the part, that would help establish my credibility? Because again, the more credible the messenger, the more credible the message. Okay, framing for common ground relates back to something I mentioned in class, which is I like to think of negotiation not as a fight between two people who are trying to win, but rather two people working together to problem solve the gap between where each other is coming into this negotiation. So if you could frame the negotiation in a common ground, a perspective that we both could relate to, like, hey, I know we're both in the business of providing high value to our customers. So let's think of a way that we could work together to collaborate on this thing. We can also talk about framing in a more metaphorical way, which is how, for example, I'll use Hacker and Star. These two gentlemen have been fighting, and there would be some value, of course, of them coming together after this fight and agreeing that their partnership is important. But here's the thing about frames. When they are presented in a compelling way, it provides this powerful illustration, and a picture's worth 1,000 words, a powerful illustration of what it is that we want that is superior for us collectively as opposed to just one of us. So for example, I would imagine using a metaphor like, listen, Stan, we've been working on Hacker Star products for a while, and we've been rowing this canoe in sync with one another, but right now seems like we are rowing in circles. We're not on the same page. We're not in sync. And I'd really like to see us getting back to where we were paddling this canoe and moving forward. Now, I know some of you are rolling your eyes right now, but again, the use of a metaphor in addition to these perspectives creates not only a compelling way to think about the overarching context or frame in which this negotiation sits, but it also could potentially create a structure through which these decisions can be made. For another example, we talk about diversity and the value of diversity. And in and of itself, we can certainly make that argument, but that use of metaphor again could be really powerful. Like, think of the most diverse salad bar there is. And isn't the salad more beautiful, more tasty, more textured, more fulfilling and satisfying when you can add all these different pieces together on one plate? Now, again, some of you might be thinking that sounds corny, and that's fine, but using a metaphor like that and coming back to it can be so powerful. And by the way, for those of you who are thinking, well, all right, mixed salad, that sounds interesting, but why not perhaps a stew? Well, for my money, the stew metaphor is different objects that are like a melting pot thrown in the crock pot together for hours to the point where it all kind of tastes the same. Now again, that might not be how you envision stews or melting pots, but that's one reason why thinking ahead of time for about a frame that could be compelling and illustrative, that is this kind of a surface, like a wave that you can ride throughout the negotiation, where you could then come back to it, this sort of theme and variations that would be exceptionally powerful. So once you've created this frame, use the frame together and involve the other party to search for this optimal solution. So again, it's us against the problem. How can we both be interested in each other's ideas? How can we support each other's ideas? When we work together and we bounce ideas off of one another, brainstorm together, the solutions that arise may be more beneficial than any one person could have come to the table with previously. So that's kind of the cool thing of engaging in this joint problem solving. One tactic that you might consider is actually having the other person engage in part of the process to demonstrate their commitment to this outcome. So, for example, in healthcare offices, before all of us had our trusty Outlook or Google calendars, what you would see most typically is a business card which had the address and phone and doctor's name, and on the back an open line where you could pencil in the date and time of the appointment. And what researchers found is that the difference between the receptionist writing in that appointment time and handing the card to you versus you actually writing that time in once you've looked at your calendar, the commitment was significantly higher in the latter case. So this is kind of, again, this idea of we're in this together. It's not my solution that you agree to, but actually this is our solution that we both have involvement in. I don't need to say much about this. This is kind of a tactic that is used pretty often, right? Look at the data. Here are our charts. Before the use of this product, you have this problem, but after the use you have, right? So the before and after photos, right? These are things that are logical, and they present compelling evidence from the basis of facts and logic and data. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's important to select those arguments that are going to be more aligned with others' needs and motivations. And just as an aside, among these tactics, while logic has been shown to be the most effective across all cultures that have been tested, pressure tactics are the least effective, and we kind of talked about that. So finally, the sixth characteristic, reinforce with emotions. Notice it's not first. Okay, so when you've tried everything else and you still haven't gotten there, they're still not convinced about your new product or process, one way to reinforce your persuasive argument is to appeal to their feelings, their fears, their desire to be part of the crusade. Some of you may be too young to recall, but Sybil Shepherd is an actress who used to play the co-lead role in a sitcom called Moonlighting with Bruce Willis. And Sybil Shepherd, who I think started her career as a model and then became an actress, had a very recognizable voice. In fact, so recognizable that Mercedes used her and her voice in a radio ad for their car. And I remember the first time I heard this radio ad while I was in the car, and I just went, wow, this is brilliant. So Sybil Shepherd is, like any celebrity endorser, is talking about how luxurious the car is and the high quality whole grained leather and the German engineering and all the cool bells and whistles that this car has. And then she pauses for effect and she says, do you want to know the 3 most important reasons that I drive a Mercedes? Pause. And then she names her 3 children. Right? So in that moment, the fact that a Mercedes is more expensive than many other sedans has now become the way to keep your children safe. Think of the fear, right? Being in a car accident. So this idea of reinforcing with emotions is kind of the cherry or the icing on the cake. So, again, this could be very powerful. And as you noticed in some of the readings, emotions, there's sort of a good and a bad, and we'll come back to that. In addition to reinforcing with emotions, I like to include some of the work of Robert Cialdini. And he talks about 6 basic instincts that our brains don't process. So let me think about that and run that through my brain, but rather trigger an automatic response. He calls it in his writing the click-whir response. Click, and the machine turns on without any thought. And so I don't want to spend that much time talking about these. They're in the text. And there's a wonderful video link that's about 11 or 12 minutes that he is one of the narrators, does a beautiful job of explaining these 6 basic instincts. Briefly, I'll show you in the next slide an example of these 6 instincts and what they are and how they could be used. So these are attributed to Robert Cialdini. So you can pause if you'd like to read through them, but I want to move forward and not take too much more time. So we've been talking about persuasion, and well, I'm sure many of you have been in situations where after a persuasive conversation, you might have felt somehow manipulated, somehow lied to, or perhaps exaggerated. And, we could get into a long conversation about what isn't ethical behavior. And frankly, I think you would agree that it's not black and white, that while, outright lies are certainly unethical, there are other things that we'll discuss in a moment that make it difficult to have a definitive conversation about this, but let's have a conversation. Another element about this, what is and isn't ethical, depends on who you ask. And I don't just mean, somebody who's successful, therefore they are doing it right, but cultures have different views and values as to what is ethical behavior. I know that in some cultures, it is absolutely appropriate to grease the skids to get somebody or some organization to, kind of a bit of a bribe. And in this country, oh my God, no, absolutely not. Don't even mention that. We'll never do that. And in other countries, what we call a bribe, they call standard operating procedure. And I'm not going to throw any country under the bus, but I'm sure for those of you who have traveled extensively, worked abroad, worked with companies that are global, you have noticed that your value system and what you consider right and wrong, moral and immoral, ethical and unethical, would not necessarily match that of others. And so making the assumption that ethics are universal would be incredibly inaccurate. So let's talk about ethically ambiguous, because that would be in between the one end and the other end of the spectrum. And the question there is, well, what exactly is truth? And one element that I like to consider is the difference between omission and commission. Now, those of you who are more black and white would say a lie is a lie is a lie, end of story. However, some also consider the difference between omission and commission. So omission is I omit, right? I forgot to mention this issue. When it's really hot outside, the car doesn't work as well. And since I'm selling the car in the winter time, I'm not going to mention this thing. And if you don't ask me directly about my car's quirks, then I'm not going to tell you. I've omitted it. Commission, some argue, is a bigger lie, a bigger ethical violation. It means you have been specifically asked about this issue and you have covered and actually told a falsehood. So think of the first two letters, co, to be a hint around cover. So you cover the truth. You specifically ignore the fact that the question's been asked and tell a falsehood. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but there are also some laws, right? So for example, in real estate, if there were some material information that whether a potential buyer were to ask or not, there's some material information that you and or the real estate agent would be inclined to share, would be required to share. And so, for example, if you knew that a major highway were going to be constructed and run through your neighborhood, that would be material information. And so, again, it's really hard to have this conversation one way, but you can imagine that this would be an important conversation to be mindful of. Now, in terms of ethics and where you stand, how do you ensure that your behavior is ethical? Well, one thing I would encourage you to do is read this wonderful article by Deepak Malhotra, and it gives you some ways to prepare. If you have some elements that are less than favorable in the package you're trying to get the other person to quote unquote buy, how do you speak in ways that make lies true? How do you find ways to couch what you're going to say so that you don't find yourself lying or telling untruths? Now, what about addressing others' unethical behavior? Well, two ways to look at this is prevention and intervention, and those are our next two slides. So one way to prevent being manipulated or being treated in an unethical way is to be clear on your position, your convictions. The sin of commission is less likely to happen when you prepare plenty of questions, plenty of open-ended and detailed questions to ensure that you understand all elements of the issue at hand. Also, take the time to really think about the other side's arguments. And even if that means, especially if that means not agreeing at the end of the negotiation, but giving yourself 24 to 48 hours. Another element is just to, without being nasty about it, doubt the truth of what's being said, or said differently, ask, can you tell me the source of that? Oh, you just said most of our customers. Could you give me some names? Or do you have data that shows a specific percentage of customers that have been happy with your product? I'd like to contact them. So, again, it doesn't have to come across as nasty, but, you are welcome to ask those questions to ensure that you're not manipulated. Knowing the source, where does that data come from? And also think about what might motivate somebody to lie, to exaggerate, to try to pull the wool over your eyes. What are the needs of others, and is this action good for all? The last thing that I'll mention about how you could deal with ethical issues as they appear, whereas the previous one's a little bit more prevention. Here, when you perceive you are being deceived, one thing you could do, and it's the last bullet on purpose, is ignore it. Why? Well, perhaps you're not so sure, or maybe you think you misheard, or maybe you're uncomfortable confronting. I'm not a fan of ignore the tactic for the very reason we discussed in class. To say nothing is to say it's okay, and it will embolden your negotiation opponent to continue acting in ways that are deceiving or unethical. You could deal with their deception by, as I said earlier, asking more probing questions. Well, say more about that, or can you tell me how that data were collected? Can you tell me who collected it? Would you be willing for me to try this product for 24, 48 hours without a requirement to fulfill the purchase, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some mechanisms that can be really helpful to deal with others' either current or perceived to be deceptive practices. Another element here is to recognize what it is they're doing and, quote, call it, right? Oh, it seems to me that you and your partner are kind of doing this good cop, bad cop thing. I recognize that you think this is successful, but I have to tell you, I'm not really appreciating that strategy. I wonder if we could just be honest with one another, right? So, you could call it as you see it and put it out there. Here's what I'm seeing, and here's the effect it's having on me. I would like you to consider something else that very much aligns with the framework that I gave you for speaking assertively. Another related way of dealing with others' behavior is to call them on their behavior and then help them make a better choice, right? I've noticed that you've said this, that, or the other, or I recognize you really want the sale, but I do want to remind you that we've been working together for about 10 years now, and I'm hoping that we can continue to work together with full trust. So, again, it's a way to let them know that you've heard them without necessarily rubbing their nose in it, and giving them the opportunity to adapt, to change, to stop doing it. Why that's so important is because anytime you corner someone, you're going to create defensiveness. And you may say, well, they're being unethical, so therefore tit for tat. I don't see it that way. All right, some additional strategies and tactics. One that the book talks about is called inoculation theory. And very simply, it's a method where you anticipate the objections of another party and you state them before they do, kind of wipes the wind out of their sails. So this idea is, okay, I know that cost is an issue, but let me tell you, here is the total ownership cost. And if we scrimp and save and buy a cheaper product early on, in the long run, it's actually going to cost more. Here is my chart to show this, right? So whatever you suspect the objection to be, inoculation theory, which derives from virology, is to be the one to bring up the objection before they do and address it. This last theory, ACE theory, is something that is also used to plan their persuasion approach. Since I'm just about at 50 minutes, I'm going to not describe it fully here. It's also in the text, but I will in our session together. Finally, emotions in negotiation. And as you read in that wonderful article in the Harvard course pack, recognize that there are disadvantages and advantages. And, you know, for many of us, again, thinking back on prior negotiations, one of the disadvantages of showing your emotions, being emotional, is it can signal a lack of emotional intelligence, and others may try to take advantage. Oh, they're not playing fair here, or they seem pretty riled up. Let me see if I can, you know, kick them while they're down. It could also come across as being uncollaborative. So, you know, being again, within reason, if you are extreme with your emotions, it may backfire. But as that article points out, you shouldn't tamp down, lock it up, and just speak about the logic and the need for this new idea, this product, etc. You know, showing some emotion is great because it shows your passion for this issue. It shows your passion for resolving the situation. And because of this genuineness, this being human, relating to others, showing emotion, appropriate emotion, can facilitate creativity, decision making, and relationship building. So if you haven't read that article, I would suggest you do. We'll talk a little bit more about specific emotions and deciphering them from facial expressions. But one piece of advice I will mention is when you do see somebody make a face or show emotion on their face, be careful not to assume and act as though, right? Oh, I can tell you're pissed off at me, so, you know, let's just stop, right? But use a perception check, and it sounds something like this. I noticed you pushed away from the table after Ken's last comment. Should I assume that you're frustrated with our progress? And pause and wait for the answer. So by noting the behavior, noting the specific behavior and sharing it in a way that takes responsibility, I language, and giving them a chance to respond, no, that's not accurate. No, I'm sorry. I got an email from somebody while, you know, we were having this meeting, and I'm a little frustrated, right? So we'll do more of this later, but I just wanted to kind of touch this a little bit. Well, thank you so much for listening.